Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Kachijian, and today I'm joined by Allison Brager. Major Allison Brager is a U.S. Army soldier and neuroscientist. Her research includes studying survival in extreme environments, under sleep deprivation and stress, and why some individuals are resilient and others vulnerable under such conditions. In the Army, she builds a team of teams, providing cutting-edge technologies, knowledge products, and solutions for fatigue management on the battlefield. She is the author of Meathead, Unraveling the Athletic Brain, a popular science book. Allison also enjoys athletics. She's a two-time CrossFit Games and regional competitor and has competed internationally in track and field as a pole vaulter. A PhD in physiology, Allison has essentially devoted her life to stressing her body at the highest level of sport and studying the limits of performance in the lab. Here, we discuss the nature of her research in the Army and the things she's doing to help soldiers prepare for the most grueling physical and psychological environments. And oh, by the way, Allison is also trying to become an astronaut. Allison, thank you so much for joining us here. There's so many things that we could talk about. You've got such a really diverse background, and a lot of the things are kind of related. So I guess I kind of want to begin by just hearing a little bit about your before your military background and your background as a neuroscientist, a little on your athletic background. So if I'm not mistaken, you were a heptathlete and a pole vaulter in college. So how did you get into doing that? Because I always have a soft spot for generalists, and I think that your athletic career is kind of a microcosm for the rest of your life, where you've got very varied interests. So how did you end up doing all those different events in track and field?
Yeah, so I was a gymnast growing up, gymnast and a dancer. And I always knew I would be a sprinter and a jumper because let's be real, anything more than running a mile was just terrible for me. Like, I come from a family of athletes. Two of my uncles are world-class boxers. I had a great uncle who was a linebacker for the New York Giants. And actually, the number jersey he wore was that of Zach DiOssi, who was a Brown graduate who played football and then went on to play football for the Giants. And he wore my great uncle Lou Slavy's number. Weird story.
Very cool.
But yeah, so I was always a power athlete. And my junior year of high school, my track coach was really well connected with the state politics, the track and field, and she found out that pole vault was going to be contested for the first time for girls in the history of Ohio. So she got me linked up with the Ohio State University coach, and he taught me how to pole vault. And I ended up being recruited by Brown for hurdles and for pole vault. And then obviously, because I could pole vault, by the end of my time in college, most of us who were recruited at Brown for pole vault ended up being heptathletes because you could do the other events if you could pole vault, since it's so specialized.
Yeah, and what are the other events, just to clarify for the audience then?
So pole vault is actually not one of the events.
Okay.
Yeah, it's totally separate. Pole vault is in the decathlon, but it's not in the heptathlon.
Right. Okay.
So the heptathlon, it always ends with the worst thing ever, which for women was the 800, and for men, it's the 1500-meter run.
Yeah.
But the field events are shot put, long jump, javelin, and high jump, and then it's 200-meter and 100-meter hurdles, and then the 100-meter sprint. Or no, that's right. Yeah, the 100-meter hurdles and the 200-meter dash. So
got it.
Yeah. Now indoors though, we do 5 events. So obviously they don't do javelin. And oh my God, I can't even remember what other event we don't do. Shot put. But yeah.
So, I mean, it makes sense that if you're a pole vaulter, that can translate into a sprint and maybe a jump. But I mean, things like shot put and the different throws are pretty technical. So you get to college and you have no background in the throws, and then they just teach you how to do it. What's that process like? I mean, is it pretty easy to pick up if you're athletic? Because those are very technical events.
So it's interesting you say that, because so one of my high school teammates was a 4-time Olympic trial competitor in the shot put. She won like 13 NCAA titles. And there's actually a documentary about her called Into the Distance. And I say this because it talks about the technicalities and how specialized and how athletic you have to be to throw the shot put. I would say hands down, the two hardest events in track and field are throwing the javelin, because there's a lot of torque and there's a lot of finesse to getting the javelin to actually stick into the grass. Because if it just like coasts along this grass, it doesn't count as a mark. It has to actually stick into the ground.
Okay.
It's much harder than it looks. And then throwing a shot put in terms of timing the release correctly, and like making sure you're going straight and not crooked is a lot of work.
Okay. And so, I'm interested in this question just because I know that, and we'll get into your CrossFit background, and you have a high level training background where, from like a programming standpoint, how does like your typical week or training block look? I'm just interested in, you have all these different skill sets and, kind of like a range of physiology that you have to develop from, a very like explosive event like the javelin or the shot put, and then in 800, which, I'm guessing that you're all finishing like in the kind of, low twos somewhere. So kind of just a different bandwidth of physiology. How
Yeah.
are you preparing for that in terms of like technical sessions and programming for all those different events during the week? What does that typical training week look like? I know it might vary like at the time in the season, but more like conceptually.
Well, I will say I spent a lot of time at the, we'll use some Brown acronyms, the OMAC,
Yep.
where all the varsity sport athletes, at least their locker rooms were, and where the track and field team were. Spent a lot of time there and in the weight room, doing multiple different practice sessions across the day. And honestly, I think that's why I fell in love with doing CrossFit, and especially competitive CrossFit, because we do multiple different highly specialized training sessions across the day. It totally reminded me of training for the heptathlon. The other thing about the heptathlon too that reminds me of CrossFit, and it's the same with pole vault, is you can't pole vault and you can't throw the javelin and you can't shot put every single day, because you're over exhausting those neuromuscular pathways.
Yeah.
And it's a great way to like augment fatigue and burnout.
Right. So like in a typical week, I mean, how many days a week are you throwing versus doing pure, speed and sprint work versus doing more kind of like anaerobic or capacity type work for the 800? Like, what does that structure look like during the course of a week? And then even just developing the technique in some of those events. It's just a lot of bases to cover.
Yeah, so I would say the golden rule. I like Brown had really awesome, just track and field coaches. When you were there, there was like the legacy program of, I don't know if you've heard of Bob and Ann Rothenberg. Like,
Yes,
they
of course.
were the most successful track coaches, not just at Brown, but in track and field in general. Like, and the program sort of died off after they both retired. But a lot of the specialized coaches adopted the model of the Rothenbergs, which was, basically you would train whatever event no more than 2 days a week to prevent that neuromuscular burnout. So for the heptathletes, you sort of the coach had to like make sure that for every event that you were having that specialized training 2, and if not more than 2 times a week. And then same with, honestly, we didn't train for the 800, because the 800 is one of those things. It's just like, the whole Prefontaine thing of just like ripping it and hanging on for dear life. Like, I think that's pretty true of any coach who coaches the heptathlon, is they just rely on that athlete's sheer grit and tolerance for pain to hope that they, run a decent time.
Yeah, and that makes sense, because and just like in the decathlon, like the 800 and the heptathlon, the 1500 and the decathlon are the physiological outliers. And I don't know what's worse, like actually training for those events to be better at it, even though it's probably going to detract from everything else, where at least you're kind of prepared for that really crappy race, or just saying, you know what, I'm just going to suck it up on race day with pretty much no training and just go all out. Like, I don't know if it's worse to just get all that stress at once, or to kind of just prepare for it a little bit more so you know what you're getting into. But that's got to be pretty miserable if you're not doing any of that kind of work. And then just on race day, you're just like, okay, I'm going to run as hard as I can for 2 minutes when all I do in practice is just throw stuff for a few seconds and sprint for no more than maybe, 20 seconds in a 200. Like that's pretty rough.
Well, it's rough because if you ever watch the 1500 or the 800 of any heptathlon or decathlon, you just have to look at the pain face when they're coming around that like 200-meter turn. It is terrible. And I don't really think you can train for it because by the time you get there, you are so fatigued from the other 7 or 9 events for the men that you've already done that
Right.
like there's really no way to train for that fatigue unless you're doing stuff in the weight room. Not that CrossFit existed at the time, but like I feel like we would do stuff similar to CrossFit. There's like repeatability complexes where you're lifting 80% of your 1 rep max over a 7 to 8 minute period to train that neuromuscular fatigue. I think that's the only way you can even mirror or train that like fatigue you feel at the end of the 800 or 1500-meter run.
Okay, so then you competed in the pole vault and the heptathlon in college. What were you more successful at generally?
Definitely pole vault. So I actually didn't do the heptathlon until the very end of my career at Brown. So
Okay.
so when Anne was like directing the program, I was just a pole vaulter. But then I think really what happened is we were looking for more points to score within the Ivy League championships. And
Okay.
so our head coach at the time had this bright idea of taking the pole vaulters more so than in the past and turning us into heptathletes to score as many points as possible because at Brown, our biggest rivals were Cornell and Princeton. During the Rothenberg era, everyone was untouchable. Like Brown was untouchable. But then after they retired, Princeton and Harvard in particular really built up their recruiting. And so, yeah, it was basically they were trying to war game, right? Like they were trying to maximize the amount of points we got at the Ivy League championships because, that's like a big deal, not just in track and field, but like all the other sports within the Ivy League, especially rowing. There's so much like deep rooted rivalry and history and tradition with the Ivies competing against each other. I mean, it was the first athletic conference, right, in the entire US for college. So it makes sense.
Yeah, and then so you have the track and field career where you're training in multiple events, and then you at some point segued into competitive CrossFit. So at what point was that like right after you finished competing in college? 'Cause it seems like a pretty natural transition going from the heptathlon. You've got this varied background growing up in gymnastics and dance. You've got a pretty good, foundation for movement, which translates into Olympic lifting and this gymnastics specific work in CrossFit. So when did you make that transition from track and field into CrossFit?
So funny how it happened. When I graduated Brown in 2007, CrossFit had just started in California. It hadn't like reached the rest of the US. So at that time, I went right to graduate school at Kent State where I got my PhD. And I actually was still competing in pole vault, just for fun because it really was, I fell in love with the sport and I didn't really grow into the sport until college because I didn't start pole vault until my junior year of high school.
Okay.
So I competed in track and I also coached track for a local high school throughout my entire time in graduate school. But what I really missed most was the camaraderie of the weight room. So I don't know if you ever had been in the varsity weight room of Brown. It is much different now, but the old weight room that we used to nickname Iron City, I just missed doing the Olympic lifts and I missed like the camaraderie that was built in.
Yeah.
And so actually one of my teammates at Brown, Grant Bowen, he graduated my year, was pole vaulter. He told me that he started doing CrossFit. And then I had a friend from high school, Dan Bailey, who was local in Ohio at the time, would go on to like compete in multiple CrossFit games. I started just doing CrossFit. And one reason I did have to start was I kept getting kicked out of the rec center at Kent State for doing a lot of the ball plyometric drills and
Okay.
like trying to do Olympic lifting in the rec center. I'm sure it's very different now, but like I used to do all these like conditioning exercises on the basketball court that Coach Ann Rothenberg taught me, and like they had enough of me, and I basically was like forever banned from the Kent State rec center.
Right.
So, but yeah, that's how I fell in love with CrossFit, and it was immediate because it immediately reinvigorated that camaraderie and that competitive edge that I had missed training on my own for so long. You know, I would like run with my high school athletes and I would vault as much as I could with my high school athletes, but it wasn't the same, right? Because I had to have that dual role as a coach, and I didn't want to be selfish and just pole vault for myself and not help them in any capacity. But yeah, it's been great. I've been very lucky. I've been doing CrossFit now for almost 12 years, have never had any injuries that were career ending or required surgery. I've, competed in 2 CrossFit games on a team, and then twice in regionals as an individual. Compete as a masters now. Just basically do the best I can. As I like to say, I'm a washed up games athlete. And what I mean by that is like I'm fitter now in some ways, but I will never be as fit to sustain the level of volume it takes to like train and compete for the games ever again. The last 2 years being on the CrossFit team for the Army has been a rude awakening for me, that like my body just, it doesn't have it in me to be at that level anymore. But also I have competing priorities, right? Because I really value being a neuroscientist, and now I'm about to take command of a unit. Like I can't do both professional and athletic endeavors at the same time anymore.
Yeah, and when you were competing at the games level, like what did the training require in terms of the commitment? And at that point in your life, what were the competing demands? Like, was that when you were getting your PhD, or you completed your PhD, during the point at which you were competing in the games?
Oh, so that was during my postdoc. So
Okay.
remember that games have sort of evolved over time. So back from the start of the games history in 2010 up through, I'd say, 2016, as long as you were a collegiate athlete, like a D1 collegiate athlete, you could train 1 to 2 hours a day and make it to the CrossFit Games, because you had spent your lifetime, right, building up that training base and building up that lactic acid threshold and shuttle system. But in 2016, transitioned more into a professional sport where everyone who goes to the games now, I mean, they train and compete full time, right?
Yeah.
So there's that. And then the other thing too is I was a postdoc, and much like being a postdoc and a resident, yeah, you have a crazy schedule, right? Like sometimes you have to do nights. I definitely did a lot of nights doing sleep research, but you also have flexibility in your schedule when you're not working. So because I funded my own research through NIH grants, I could basically make my schedule where I would train in the morning, then spend time in the lab, then go back for a second training session, and then go back to the lab at night to get my work done, because my research was self-funded. I was funding my salary and my actual research.
Yeah, I know you do a lot of your research in sleep science, and you're a big advocate for sleep. So were you able to sleep at that point? Training 2 or 3 times a day, and then spending all your extra time in the lab.
Well, here's the thing: is like if you want to be a really good sleep researcher, there's times where you cannot practice what you preach. It's the same thing today. Like when I was chief of the Sleep Research Center at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, there was plenty of times where I did overnights with the participants, just watching and monitoring that our studies were running effectively, where I wouldn't sleep for like 40 or 50 hours. And actually, we did a study in Kuwait 3 years ago that we looked at the direct relationship between sleep loss and combat effectiveness. And that study kept me awake for 70 hours straight.
Oh, you were one of the participants in the study.
Oh, no, I was the researcher. And I was, you know what I mean? I had to stay awake because I had to collect all the data.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So they were doing a nighttime fire and a daytime fire exercise. It was an armored tank division. And so I had to be out there monitoring their marksmanship performance while they're doing this. And, you have the preparation, and then you have the actual mission training, and then the recovery. So I had to stay awake and collect all that data. So I think what we should do as sleep scientists is, when we're not doing actual research, like, I get plenty of sleep. I make sure that I get 7 or 8 hours when I can, in preparation for those times where I'm not going to get sleep.
Yeah, and that's funny because, and anybody listening is going to be like just nodding their heads and laughing, but any like strength and conditioning conference that I've been to, and these are the coaches that are constantly telling athletes to sleep more, like watch their nutrition, their lifestyle, like any of those conferences, it's like everyone's up late eating crappy food and drinking and not sleeping,
Yeah.
and hanging out. It's like all the stuff that we're like telling our athletes, like, yeah, you're in college, but you should be going to bed early and not partying, and but
Yeah.
we're all humans. So that's
No,
how
and
it
it's
goes, I guess.
true. And it's
Yeah,
funny you say that, Doug, because next week is my annual sleep medicine conference. And I will not sleep next week because
right.
uh, so here's the thing, is like, those people become your family. Like, I don't have a family
Yes.
of my own. They are my science family. I see them once a year. And so because I only get to see them once a year, even if I may talk to them every day through text or like here and there over the phone, like, we maximize our time together. So it's yeah, sometimes you can't practice what you preach.
Right. And I think that it's actually healthy to deviate sometimes, and and be a human. But yeah, so I mean, we've kind of covered your athletic career there, and then you also have an academic side. So you ended up, according to your bio, you've got a PhD in physiology, but your focus is more, from what I can tell, in neuroscience, and now you're a neuroscientist with the Army. So, did you know prior to your PhD that you wanted to be a scientist for the military, and kind of how did that evolve from you, getting a PhD? What kind of research did you do? What was your research interest at that point? And how did that evolve into you becoming a physiologist and a neuroscientist for the Army?
So much like we talked about pre-show, I had no interest in joining the military or doing science for the military ever. Um, how I ended up in the military doing science for the military is I had the opportunity to work with Dr. Tom Bolkin, who basically is like the king of how sleep deprivation, whether acute sleep deprivation or chronic sleep deprivation, affects next day performance. So I've always sought out my PhD mentors, my postdoc mentors, and then this fellowship with the Army through the science, because at the end of the day, I'm spending so much time doing something and sacrificing so many other areas of my life that I damn better be sure that I like am passionate about what I'm studying. And so that's how I ended up working for the Army. Is I went there on a National Academies of Science fellowship, and my first day there, the director of military psychiatry and neuroscience was like, "Hey, you would make a great Army officer. Have you ever thought about joining the military?" And I was like, "Well, I did have like this sense of purpose of joining the military. At Brown, I did think about doing the officers candidate school with the Marines. I was telling you, Tony Hatella, who graduated in 2004. But I had a minor foot injury my sophomore year of track. And so that like totally wiped out my opportunity to join. But I had always wanted to join too because of 9/11. So a lot of my mom's side of the family is from New York and New Jersey and the surrounding area. And so I saw the direct impact of 9/11, not just, on my family, but our country. So I viewed it as a second chance to serve. But yeah, that's how I ended up. I mean, neuroscience, that interest was peaked at Brown. So, the one thing about Brown is, we really started the field of neuroscience. Like Brown and Harvard were the first two institutions in the world to start neuroscience. And how I ended up in sleep research is because okay, granted, I had always paid attention to my sleep growing up. I was a two-sport athlete year round, did dance and gymnastics in addition to track and field. I always knew sleep was important, and I never ever sacrificed my sleep because it really is what helped me like excel in school as well. But I took the psychology of sleep course because remember there's those classes at Brown that the athletes took because they were an
Yeah.
easy pick. So like Rocks for Jocks and Russian literature and oceanography. Well, bless her heart, Dr. Mary Karskadin, best, first woman trailblazing sleep scientist in the world. Her class was viewed as one of those gut courses by the athletes. And that's why I took it. But I absolutely fell in love with
Okay.
research. And I asked her after that, because as a sophomore, if I could work in her lab. Because I knew I wanted to do a bachelor's of science at Brown instead of the bachelor's of arts. And to do that, you had to do like intensive research hours and write an undergraduate thesis. So starting my sophomore year, I started working for Dr. Mary Karskadin, and I worked in her lab all the way through the end of Brown. And honestly, today I talk to Mary almost every single day. She's so excited about my opportunity to be an astronaut. And like, she really has shaped my career in more ways than one, even though if initially I took her class for an easy A.
Okay. And so like the research that you did in your PhD program and then going into the Army, was it more clinical or was it always performance based like it is now?
So it was actually basic animal models.
Okay.
My area of expertise is neuropsychopharmacology, which is I'm looking at the direct impact of drugs on targeted brain regions and targeted receptors and signals. So because of that, I can do surgery in 3 different animal species.
Really?
I've done brain surgeries in mice, hamsters, and rats,
Huh.
where we would insert, they're called cannulae into targeted brain areas using a specific surgery table that has specific coordinates based on a well-defined brain atlas. And then I worked on alcohol and cocaine. So I looked at the impact of alcohol and cocaine mutually exclusively on how it prevented the ability of an animal to shift to cues in the environment. So it's
Okay.
basically like a model of jet lag. Like, how does alcohol and how does Coke make the circadian clock stop working when it's presented with conflicting light information or conflicting social information?
Very cool.
And
And
then
so, yeah.
I
Okay.
went
Sorry, go
from
ahead.
that to helping soldiers downrange. But it's not very different, right? Because a lot of the research we do at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research are clinical trials where we are looking at new use cases for existing hypnotic stimulants and other pharmacologics to help soldiers survive and thrive in extreme austere environments.
Okay. Yeah, and it's like when you arrived at at your unit in the Army, whether it was like initially as a researcher and then as an officer slash researcher, like what kind of problems were you responsible for helping to solve or questions were you trying to answer in terms of like soldier performance?
So a lot of it depends on we call them capability gaps. So one of the things that Walter Reed specifically works on is combat casualty care in austere environments where it might be 48 to 72 hours
Hmm.
before a soldier is medevaced. So
Okay.
how can that soldier possibly survive? How do we manage blood loss? How do we manage any sort of internal trauma to prevent sepsis? Like, what kind of drugs and what kind of technologies do we use to prevent that? We also are looking at how do we accomplish a mission where we know the soldier is going to be awake for 48 hours and we have to keep them awake. What's really interesting is just 2 months ago in the Brown Alumni magazine, they had a really investigative report about this topic, about how back in the day, like the US Army, much like other military forces, were using heroin and methamphetamines and other things to increase pain tolerance and to keep soldiers awake in order to accomplish the mission. I'd like to say we're kind of doing the same thing now, except using obviously legal pharmacologics with very controlled responses. So a lot of times what we'll do is we'll do head-to-head comparisons of, for example, different sleep hypnotics. So why does this sleep hypnotic work better than another in terms of promoting restorative sleep with limited sleep opportunities? So like if a soldier only has 4 hours to sleep, do you give them a half a dose of Ambien or do you give them a full dose of this new pharmacologic called suvorexant. And what is better? So it's kind of like we take these particular scenarios downrange and then bring it back to the lab, and are basically like well-trained alchemists, if you will, to figure out solutions.
Yeah, I mean, you can either get into the details or not, depending on the nature of the research and its classification status. But have you been able to definitively answer in the scenario of like comparing Ambien to another drug, like which one is definitively better?
No, so that study is finally off the ground right now. For a long time, I've always thought of Ambien as the devil's drug, so much so that the research that had been done on Ambien within the military made it so it's now banned by the Office of the Army Surgeon General. So the conventional Army can no longer get a prescription of Ambien on the long haul flight over to Iraq or Afghanistan because if they happen to be boots on ground as soon as the plane lands, there's been studies to show that their level of cognitive impairment is greater than being legally drunk.
Wow. Okay. And I'm guessing then that the sleep that you do get from Ambien is not particularly restorative then?
No, it's not. And that's exactly the point. So that's what these new studies are looking at. So Ambien, I think there's a Navy SEALs doc who found that it's non-restorative because it actually reduces levels of anabolic hormones in the body, like testosterone.
Okay.
And it's also like the EEG, the sleep brain activity, looks like that of an unconscious person more so than a human that's in the deeper stages of sleep. And then, of course, the other issue is what we call sleep inertia, which is this drowsiness that is prolonging after waking in the morning. So those are the underlying issues. But, if you reduce the dose or change the timing of the dose, you can, in some sense, mitigate these issues because pharmacology is very complicated and actually is dependent on your basal metabolic rate and how your basal metabolic rate changes across the day and the night. So
Okay.
There's a lot of tinkering involved to come up with the perfect recipe. And it's really something, I guess to give an example, like the Army has spent over 20 years developing very precise caffeine dosing schedules. And now they are included in a freely available app in the Apple Store called Peak Alert, where it uses machine-based algorithms to predict your current level of vigilance and attention. And then based on that, it will give you a caffeine dosing schedule to make sure that your performance stays within baseline levels. All of that comes from over 20 years of research done at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research by Tom Balkin and colleagues, because there's so many different scenarios with when to give caffeine and the amount of caffeine that should be given under different conditions of sleep deprivation.
That's really cool. And then, so as a sleep researcher, for you, when you're doing these studies, like how do you define objectively a good night of sleep, so to speak? Like, what's the gold standard? Because people can take Ambien and be like, oh yeah, like it made me sleep. And you're saying that objectively, they didn't get a good night of sleep. So what kind of metrics are you using to determine if someone did indeed get a quote unquote good night of sleep?
Okay, love that question. So there's two ways. It's both subjective and objective. So objectively, using, it's called PSG or polysomnography. It's basically like putting a series of electrodes over certain areas of the brain. So the frontal regions, the temporal regions, and the hind regions of the brain. There's this particular state of brain activity called slow wave activity, or SWA. And SWA is a measure of restorative sleep. Ideally, a person who has restorative sleep objectively should spend 30% or greater of their total sleep time with SWA.
Okay.
So that's the objective assessment. The subjective assessment, believe it or not, after all these years of research, and we have very clinically validated questionnaires, the most important question to ask is, do you feel like you are restored and recovered, and do you require stimulants to stay awake? If the answer is no, no, I don't feel restored and recovered, and yes, I use stimulants, then it wasn't restorative sleep. If the answer is yes, I feel recovered, and no, I don't use stimulants, then you're fine. And I get asked this all the time because, one of the things about military people, especially that I work a ton in the SOCOM community, in the special operations community, and they're all coming to me with this anxiety of, hey, I only sleep 4 hours a night, like fix my sleep. And I have to ask them this question because at that level, much like the US presidents, much like some of the high level executives in corporate America, those people pre-select as short sleepers.
Yeah.
There is a reason I truly believe they're successful because they possess the short sleeping gene, which is a naturally occurring mutation in this gene called DEC2 that allows them to only get 4 hours of sleep and be able to focus and work and thrive 18 hours a day. They're just very genetically lucky.
That's really interesting. So there are people who can sleep 4 hours a night and be fine and not have a performance deficit. Okay.
Yeah, it's been studied over the years in both animal and human models. And like I said, historically, the U.S. presidents, not that they've ever genotyped them, but almost every single president that has written an autobiography, and somebody has looked at this, writes about how, they burn the candle until late into the night and stay up until 1 and wake up at 5.
And then do any of the different sleep studies that are comparing, say, like different types of drugs or sleep protocols ever do kind of like a pre and post, obviously with controls, where they're testing the impact of these drugs, for like a given amount of sleep on performance? So it's like, whatever, if it's a pilot, you put them in the simulator and you have different types of full mission profiles that you can kind of, like do a pre and post to compare. Because obviously certain things like measuring EEG levels, like that's kind of an abstraction that from a performance standpoint, it might correlate with performance. But, and I always like asking researchers this because even something like VO2 max, it's like we care about VO2 max because it's a proxy for performance in an aerobic event, but ultimately we care about like how fast did you run a marathon or do a triathlon, right? Like, are there any direct performance studies that kind of test some of these different sleep protocols as well, or does that just involve too many variables where it makes the study too difficult to conduct and perform in a rigorous way?
Nope, absolutely. So I don't trust a study unless they do what we do at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research with every single one of our studies. One, it's randomized, which means like if you're getting that drug, you're going to be in different treatment groups where you might get this dose of the drug in one part and this dose of the drug in another part. So it's order effects. Another requirement is it's placebo controlled. Another requirement is it's also a crossover study, which basically means that you're going to go from like one of two conditions. So you might go without the drug and then get the drug, or get the drug and not get the drug, which is why every single study that we have ever done is no shorter than like an 18-day in-lab study. Like our research participants spend a lot of time in the lab because we also have these washout periods. And we even do that with different doses of sleep deprivation too. Like sometimes you might be deprived of sleep for 24 hours. Sometimes you might get 70% of your sleep opportunity across 5 days. Sometimes we might extend your sleep. But those studies are like 40 days long and they're like washing it out during different periods. So we do a lot of between subject and within subject designs. Personally, I understand that not everyone has the funding like we do though, right? Like we kind of use the foundation, like even if these studies have been done by the past by a lesser funded group, like we use those studies as the foundation for our own studies because we have capital to do these studies because of, budgeting and stuff.
Right. Okay. And so there's a lot of people on this podcast, are like in the performance space, strength and conditioning coaches, physical therapists, and they talk to athletes all the time about sleep. And I'm guessing it's very similar to you educating some of the, the soldiers that you're around about sleep, where you basically devoted, a large portion of your life to becoming an expert in the subject, but they only have probably the the patience and the tolerance to listen to like a 1 minute elevator pitch. So like,
Yeah.
what's your kind of 1 minute elevator pitch in terms of like practical information you're giving to a non-expert to take all the amazing work that you've done and try to distill it into a couple of like really, practical, actionable takeaways?
First and foremost, everyone is different. Everyone can be divided up into 4 quadrants, kind of like Mendelian genetics, right? Like learning the dominant recessive genes. So you're either caffeine tolerant or caffeine sensitive, or you're sleep tolerant or sleep sensitive, which means the people we want in the military, we want them to be caffeine sensitive and sleep tolerant. The people we don't want in the military are people who are sleep sensitive, but also caffeine tolerant, because those people are the biggest risk for our safety downrange.
Right.
Because there's no getting around, if you're a soldier, there's no getting around sleep deprivation. At some point, you're going to be sleep deprived. Yeah. I got off a plane last night, close to midnight in Miami, and I had to be up for work. I wasn't there for fun. I was there for work. And I had to be up by 5 a.m. today to take my semi-annual Army PT test. There's just sometimes it's inevitable.
Yeah, and that sounds like a very Army thing to do, to put you on a trip to Miami and be like, oh, by the way, as soon as you land, you've got to take a PT test. Only exactly. In the Army. That's a very poorly planned TDY, but.
No, it's like a cruel joke, right? Like it's a good test. Like at Brown and Anne in particular, like every Monday, she would program the worst workouts you could ever imagine. Like I haven't even done workouts in CrossFit that were as bad as what Anne programmed, where you just have like rapid accumulation of lactic acid and you have to hold on for dear life. And if you didn't meet the time trial, then you had to do more. And I figured out over the years, she was doing that to see like who spent the weekend drinking. So it's like, that's kind of, not to say I spent the weekend drinking, but I just like, it made me think of that this morning, like waking up to take my test.
Right. So then you mentioned the first 2 things. Did you say there were 4?
What?
Were there 4 things as far as like the actionable items? You mentioned caffeine sensitivity, sleep sensitivity, and then as far as like the rest of kind of like the just very actionable, you got somebody with a low attention span, but you want to educate them about sleep. There was the caffeine sensitivity, the sleep, everyone's different, tolerance for different amounts of sleep. Was there anything else in terms of like, here's what like athletes, soldiers like really need to know to maximize sleep hygiene and be able to have really good sleep practices?
Yeah, basically load up on sleep in preparation for sleep loss. That's what we do. It's called sleep extension. I just did that with the U.S. Olympic weightlifting team that went over to Uzbekistan to compete, to qualify for the Olympics. There's no getting around jet lag. So I told them sleep as much as you can leading up to this. So that way your first few days, boots on ground, you don't feel like shit.
So you're saying that, because this is one of those things you hear all the time, like that you can't bank sleep. So that's actually a myth?
That is a myth. We have shown it on multiple occasions at Walter Reed. And I say that even more so because those studies ended up in the proceedings of the National Academies of Sciences, which you can't really get much better than that. Like it didn't, pull the wool over like some of the top scientists in the world's eyes who are members of the National Academies of Sciences. So
we're myth busting over here. I love it. And so switching gears briefly, just because I'm intrigued by the comment you made about some of the work you're doing in terms of tactical combat casualty care, because I thought that you were mainly doing sleep research. I didn't realize you were kind of helping to refine some of the military's trauma protocols, just because of my background and implementing some of those protocols. I'm just curious, like, as a researcher, like what are the things that are really left to answer in terms of keeping people alive on the battlefield for that, whatever it is, like from the point of injury to 72 hours, like what are we as a military and as a country, like still not doing well that we could do better in terms of, those trauma protocols that we can actually change?
Yeah, so actually I think there's 2 things that we specifically have been working on without getting too much into the details.
Right.
So one is trying to maintain, even though they've had this trauma and like point of injury, how do we keep them in this parasympathetic state? So there's actually been like teams of psychiatrists and psychologists who have worked to create this protocol for, keeping the soldier out of a state of shock just by like direct human interaction and like certain questions you ask them. That's one way. Another way is through performance enhancing drugs. That I won't get into the specifics, but there are select things about performance enhancing drugs and promoting anabolic pathways, even under severe trauma, such as open head wounds and hemorrhaging.
Okay. And so that's something that like potentially will make its way into those TCCC protocols once everything's been validated?
I think it will only stay where it is right now, which is in the SOCOM community. And the reason I say that is because I think there's just too much, although the science supports it, I just think there's too much ethical controversy over it. That's my personal opinion.
Okay. That's all really interesting. And then on top of all this research you're doing, oh, by the way, you're applying to become an astronaut now. So, what was the impetus for that? And what's the process for that?
Typical brown grad, right? Just like all over the place. No, so actually I've wanted to be an astronaut since I was 7, but so does every other 7-year-old. It's just, there's no blueprint for it.
But you actually have a legitimate shot at being one. That's the difference.
Yeah, I go for my second final interview at NASA at the end of this month. So I've been in the pipeline for about 2 years now. So the Army astronaut program has been around for a while. Every few years, they have a call to apply. So with the reinvigoration of the space program over the last 2 years, all the military branches put out a call. So 12,000 people applied for the Army. I don't know how many people applied for the Navy, Air Force, and then, the civilian sector, but they had from what I heard, over 30,000 applicants, and it's down now to, I believe, 100 people. And from that, they'll then select 50. And then from that 50, they'll select 18 of us to be the next astronaut class of 2021. And from what I've been told, we could be the first class to start training for the Mars mission.
Wow.
Which, I mean, I've told this, my mom hates that I say this. She actually called me once and was like, I can't believe you said this on a podcast. If it was a one-way mission, I would go.
Really? Okay.
I would go. There's no question.
All right. Well, I mean, between now, hopefully you get picked up for that, but between now and then, how can people get a hold of you and learn more about the work you're doing? Because it's probably a lot of people from different organizations who listen here that, they're always looking to reach out to different sleep consultants and physiological consultants. I know that you do that kind of work. So what's the best way for people to contact you if they're interested in learning more about, the services you provide?
So the best way is honestly Instagram. I actually use social media a lot now in my current Army job with the recruiting command, because that's, how you connect with America's kids these days.
Yeah.
So it's Jock ZZZ. So DOCJOCKZZZ.
Well, yeah, I mean, I appreciate your time. This is all, I could talk to you all night, but in the interest of time and catching a train, I have to go here, but
yeah,
I mean, and I'll definitely put some links in the notes to some of your research, because I'm sure people are going to want to learn about this stuff in a little bit more depth, but even just some of, identifying some of the misconceptions about sleep, and as far as that you can't bank it. I mean, I think even that is just so many of these things get perpetuated, and you're actually doing the research. So it's interesting to hear, what the science says about some of this stuff versus, kind of just some of the mythology. So
yeah, again, well, the thing is the research, again, was published in the highest impact journals in the world. That's what's cool about the military stuff, is all the research we produce, we do it for high impact science journals. We don't do anything half-ass.
Well, that and the people that are using the research, they actually have some skin in the game, and it's pretty high stakes. It's not a very abstract situation. It's as real as it gets.
Yep, it's high risk, high reward.
Yeah.
But
yeah. Well, Thank you
Yep,
again and have a great night.
of course.
Thank you for listening to the Resilient Performance Podcast. As a thank you for listening, please use promo code PODCAST for 10% off our professional development resources at resilientperformance.com. Also, make sure to sign up for our mailing list to receive exclusive content and promotions.